Welcome back. We're talking about the climate talks in Paris. Joining us from Paris is Verchot. He's the Director of Environmental Research at the Center for International Forestry Research. Also with us is the Head of International Policy at the Climate Group, Damian Ryan. Thanks to both of you. Damian, from what we know so far about what's in the draft agreement, what does this deal accomplish that others didn't?
Well, I think the key thing is that it it brings all parties into a universal climate agreement to take action, which we haven't seen in the past climate change treaties, namely the Kyoto Protocol and the original UN Climate Change Treaty of 1982.
Lou, what are the remaining issues that need to be discussed by delegates in Paris before we have a final deal?
There's a lot of elements that are still in the process of being discussed with respect to finance, with respect to some of the degree to which commitments around adaptation are being made. There's also on the table a proposal for a sustainable development mechanism, which is very contentious and completely set aside right now and needs to be resolved one way or the other. This mechanism would create funding flow to support countries achieving sustainable development while following a low emissions development pathway.
Why is that so contentious, that particular issue?
The issues are contentious because it's much more of a top-down sort of thing. This whole process is really a depart from the past and a change from the way things have been done, in that it's bottom-up. And this mechanism would actually be more of a top-down sort of mechanism, where countries need to conform to a particular mechanism, a particular set of rules, and have clear ways that finance flows from developed countries to developing countries. So again, it's a bit contrary to the spirit of the bottom-up spirit of the current negotiation as it's shaping up, and the current agreement as it's shaping up.
Damian, richer nations want emerging economies to take on more of the burden of cutting emissions, something that is being called differentiation in the terminology there at the conference. Why is that so important for developed economies?
Well, I think to describe it as taking on burden sharing is to actually characterize the whole treaty in the wrong way. Tackling climate change isn't about burden sharing, it's about embracing the opportunity that comes from creating clean, thriving, low-carbon economies. And what we can see from the current text that's on the table is that this agreement can do exactly that by mobilizing not billions in finance, but trillions, and unlocking the way to create these thriving low-carbon economies.
Lou, what about enforcing this agreement? I mean, we could have an agreement in Paris, but how is it enforced? How is it made legally enforceable?
It's not about something that's legally enforceable. Countries make voluntary commitments. They have to then report on those commitments, and every 5 years they come back and revisit those commitments, and those commitments are up for review so other countries can verify that countries have lived up to what they said they were going to do. And that's what I meant earlier when I said a bottom-up process. It's not about countries having commitments that they have to respect and penalties if they don't respect them. It's about countries volunteering and volunteering actions, volunteering finance, volunteering emissions reductions, volunteering to support adaptation and to increase climate resilience and help other countries achieve increased climate resilience. And so, as I said, it's not the top-down agreement where there are consequences. That was tried under Kyoto and it hasn't worked out so well. Now they're trying to flip it around and do this from the bottom up with countries volunteering action.
So, I mean, the question on this, Damian, is that, I mean, this depends on the good faith of all nations, right?
In terms of actually this agreement having an impact, you mean?
Yes.
Indeed, but that's true of all international treaties. There is an implicit or explicit degree of trust in any international treaty. But as your other interviewee is saying, this treaty is based on bottom-up actions, which have, as we've seen in the past, we think there's a much greater chance of having concrete action built from the bottom up than from the top down.
And Damian, what about the draft agreement provisions that says money to help vulnerable countries get to clean energy and adapt to climate change should be available in the year 2020? I mean, is everyone on board as far as that is concerned and the amount of money that is being put on the table?
This is one of the issues which is under discussion now. It's one of the crunch issues which needs to be resolved over the coming 12 to 24 hours. But there is agreement that large amounts of money do need to flow to developing countries, and this money has been flowing over the last 5 to 10 years. The other really important thing to remember is that the kinds of sums we're talking about here are also flowing in much greater quantities through the private sector. What countries want to do here is mobilize 100 billion per annum from 2020 for developing countries. Well, the truth is that every year since 2010, we've seen 250 to 300 billion already flow through the private sector into all regions of the world. And that's the real story that we need to focus on. The fact that we're talking about the opportunity to mobilize not billions, but trillions from this agreement.
Lou, what is your view on that?
No, I agree. I think that this agreement should mobilize a very significant amount of funding. We've already seen some step up in funding commitments here to support this. And I think that the support I think we see the developing country agenda much better reflected in that. There's a lot more mention of adaptation. There's a lot more mention of climate resilience. There's the mention of there's an article that will come out on forests to support countries from reducing emissions from deforestation, which is largely a part of the emissions profile of countries of the developing and emerging economies. So I think that this does respond to a lot of the needs that these countries have been voicing very strongly over the past 4 or 5 years, and I think that this is one of the key innovations and key steps forward that has been achieved here in Paris.
Damian, has the conference addressed the concerns of those countries which are already feeling the impact of climate change, particularly island nations?
Well, I think the agreement has to address their needs. I mean, this is one of the critical things from this Paris Agreement. These countries are facing existential crisis with climate change because of their low-lying, their level above sea levels. So I think what we will see is an agreement that does begin to address their concerns. Finance will be key. The loss and damage mechanism that is under discussion will be key. And I think we need to build on this over the coming years.
Lou, there was a report released in 2014 called the Global Carbon Report, which told us that 40 billion tons of CO2 has been emitted into the atmosphere. China leads with 28% of those emissions, followed by the United States with 14%. How would this agreement address that issue?
I think this agreement goes a long way in addressing that issue, particularly because these two countries actually have an agreement between themselves for reducing in the case of China, reducing the emissions intensity of its economy, and in the U.S. reducing its absolute emissions. So I think that this agreement reinforces it, but I think it's also important to understand the UN climate change agreement is not the only game in town. There is a lot that's happening between countries. We also see this with rainforest nations that have bilateral agreements with a number of countries. And for example, the Norwegians, the UK, and the Germans have announced a partnership here to increase support to these countries to deal with their deforestation emissions problems.
Damian, you've worked on climate change issues for the New Zealand government in the past. And this week, the Australian government made what many consider to be a surprising shift in its position. The Foreign Affairs Minister of Australia, Julie Bishop, signed up to that New Zealand-led declaration at the Paris summit, backing the use of carbon markets to tackle climate change. How significant was that shift?
Well, I think the change in the Australian government in recent months is sort of the main factor driving behind that. Australia does have climate policies in place. They have previously supported a carbon market, so we're seeing a shift in politics and a move back, I guess, to the centre ground of climate action. So in that respect, not entirely unexpected, but certainly great news.
Lou, your research has focused in part on greenhouse gas production in soils and understanding how land use change affects the atmosphere. What does the agreement do about that?
Well, that's one of the things that this international mechanism or international program that's developing around tropical deforestation is likely to help with, and it's also something we're trying to see opportunities for implementing emissions in agriculture sector. You know, forests emit around about 9 tons, I guess, of carbon dioxide per year, and they absorb 6 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. So it's a very important sink, and forests are on a net balance, represent about 10% of the total emissions, but for the solutions, they represent about 25% of those because they absorb so much carbon. And so having this in there with a clear article in the text, I think it helps countries who want to undertake these types of actions, anchor it much more solidly in this agreement. We already had the agreements in Warsaw, which outlined sort of the rules and regulations of how this would be done and how this would be supported, and anchoring it here to the new Paris Agreement just solidifies the support, the international support behind that, I believe.
And Damon, sitting here in the United States, of course, there are many here in the United States and elsewhere around the world who deny that there is such a thing as climate change. To which you would say what?
Look around you. The evidence for climate change is undeniable, it's uncontroversial, it's happening, it's there.